Blazing Blunderbuss by Nix Whittaker. Book 1 of the Wyvern Chronicles. Finally, out of the crawl space, Horror twisted her head first right then left. An inaudible crick produced a sigh from her parched throat. Sweat soaked through her clothes. Her calloused hand ached as she rubbed her equally aching back. The pressure made a spot numb. Short-term relief, but enough to get her moving. Horror flexed her fingers, too long, clenched around tools. With a groan, she reached down for the tool belt she had let slide to the floor when she had wriggled out of the tight confines of the maintenance tunnels. The engine hummed and hissed as steam moved through pipes. Her Opa would have been proud of the gleaming knobs and the faint whir of gears. Slipping the tool belt over her shoulder, Horror headed for her cabin. She ran a hand on the wood paneling. The mixture of machine and tooled wood reminded her of home. It was quiet except for the scrape and hiss of the man in the furnace room. Exhaustion weighed on her shoulders. Reaching her room, she let her shoulder droop and allowed the tool belt to crash to the top of the table. Bunk beds crowded up against one wall. Her bunk mate absent. He was on the night shift and wouldn't be back till morning. Horror wiggled out of her shirt. Stained with grease and oil, she draped it over the single chair in the room. With her eyelids closed over her itchy and tired eyes, she fumbled for the end of the cloth wrapped around her breasts. Women weren't normally allowed on airships. Certainly not as engineering crew. The boyish disguise was familiar to Horror, though the wrap around her breasts was a recent addition after she had left the prison. An annoying addition. She flicked the cloth to join her shirt before she poured the remains of her canteen into a bowl nestled into the stand. Horror stripped out of the overalls, rolled them around her waist and stood in her underwear as she washed up with the small amount of water and a sponge. She dreamed of a soak in a bath. Her Opa had one outside in his shed. Made for his wife, Horror enjoyed the luxury when she was home. With jets of water, the bath was perfect for massaging sore muscles and getting grease out of all her pores. She shook her head. That particular bath came with conditions she wasn't willing to live with, including making it easy for her father to find her. Horror jumped when the door slammed against the wall with a loud thud. A large man stepped into the frame of the doorway. Sailor tattoos of naked women adorned his arms. Horror scowled as she whipped a hand over her exposed parts. "I knew it," Wyvern growled. As one stoker for the boiler, she was familiar with him. He gave her a suggestive look, which crawled over every exposed piece of flesh. A meaty arm stretched over the doorframe as he pushed into the room. His size swallowed the space in the tiny cabin as he closed the door behind him. Horror backed up and reached behind her for her tool belt. Her hand fumbled while she kept her eye on Wyvern. He stalked closer. "Your hips sway too much like a girl's. You even have long hair." Which didn't really mean anything, as most of the men in the world's navies had long hair tied in queues. Her own hair lay across her shoulder but was normally trained into a tight queue. Wyvern flexed his hands in anticipation. This wasn't the first time she had been found out as a girl, but never by the sway of her hips. Horror's hand found her tool belt and she opened one pocket. She grinned when her fingers closed around a familiar round object. Wyvern grinned back at her. "I see you understand the situation, baby." She raised an eyebrow. "Do you really think I'm going to do the dirty with you?" "Well, you have to be dreaming, mate, to think that's going to happen in this lifetime." Her eyes traveled over his grotesque body. He snarled and didn't notice the movement of her other hand. Horror snapped the latch on the device in her hand and flung it at Wyvern. A net sprung from inside, tangling around him. He cursed as he struggled to escape the fine web made from the silk of spiders. Red and white lines ran across his tanned and tattooed skin. They marked the path of the thread, which was otherwise invisible to the eye. Without waiting for him to free himself, Horror picked up one of her tools to swing at his jaw. The wrench glanced off his chin, a chin in need of a sharp razor blade. Her own jaw ached in sympathy. She hadn't hit him hard enough to kill him, but he might be out for a while. If discovered in this room, people would assume Wyvern was the reason she left, which was only partly true. She was ready to move on. Maybe she wasn't ready to go home, but she was ready to stop running. Working with purpose, she packed her things and dressed. Instead of overalls, she wore a set of leather pants and a loose lawn shirt. She left off the band strapping down her breasts. With the sway of her hips, it wasn't worth it to continue to pretend to be a man. Once dressed, she strapped on her gear and made sure it wouldn't wiggle loose. She pulled a long, slender wooden box out from under her bed. She slung a leather strap attached to the box over a shoulder as she headed out of her room. She kicked Wyvern in passing just for the sake of it. Hara took the quickest way to the bottom deck, which opened to the air. She stood alone at the turned spindle baluster as most people had settled into bed by this stage of night. The air cool on her skin as it whipped at her tied-back hair. The pitch-black deck made it difficult to navigate, but she could see the twinkle of a settlement in the distance. Hara did not look forward to wandering around in the empty expanse of the Roshian plateau. At least there was hope of some civilization out there with the faint flicker of lights. Hara strapped the wooden box to her back by slipping leather straps through the metal loops over her chest. It made it hard to breathe, but better than falling to her death. Satisfied the straps would hold her, she pressed the switch at the base of the case. The box snapped open and wings spanned out. Brass and canvas spanned twice her length to each side of her. Without a glance back at the airship, she stepped into the void and let the wind take her. Gideon blinked as light cracked into the wooden box. He didn't find himself locked into a wooden box very often, so he watched the crack widen with something more than curiosity. With a loud snap, the lid of the box lifted and slumped next to it. Gideon looked up at the men, who stared in return at him. He didn't jump up and try to escape, as success wasn't likely with the bands around his wrists. Whoever had organized to kidnap him had known well their task. The bands were made of the elements which had first drawn him to this world, and it made things a little sticky when it came to his ability to change into his true form. After hours in the box and an uncounted time unconscious, Gideon doubted he was in his hometown anymore. A man growled and all the men looking down at Gideon stepped away. Gideon slowly sat up and studied the surrounding room. The seedy and rundown tavern room came complete with peeling and faded wallpaper. The sparse and faded furniture languished, unused by the men in the room. The flower pattern on the fabric now looked like a child's finger painting. The coffin-shaped box was angled towards the door, where a man stood with his arms crossed over his chest. Men filled most of the room. About half a dozen of them glared at Gideon, though he wasn't sure what he had done to deserve the dark looks. The men all wore tall black boots wrapped with leather straps. Fur dominated their clothes. They sure looked warm, and Gideon wished he had some of their fur, as he was dressed for warmer climes. Gideon flashed his teeth. "Is it possible for one of you to turn up the heat just a tad? My bones are quite brittle at my age." Everyone ignored his comment as Gideon looked around to find the man in charge. His eyes landed on the man by the door as he asked in a gravelly voice, "You Gideon, the mathematician?" Gideon studied the man. He wasn't used to being referred to as merely a mathematician. Usually there was an epithet in front of it, like annoying or moron. He rather liked moron mathematician, as it was an alliteration and there was some symmetry of the insult. He had worked at the university in the capital for the last 4 decades as a professor, and even they did not call him merely a mathematician. "I'm a mathematician, but I'm not sure I'm the one you want. I know this mathematician who looks just like me. I'm sure he would be happy to help you out, but I'm afraid my plants are going to miss me. I'm sure they're already wilting." The man shrugged. Older than most of the others in the room, his beard was peppered with grey. His fur hat covered oily hair and sported 2 shades of fur. I am Nikolai. And if you're a mathematician, then you are the one we want. The men who procured you for us wouldn't have made a mistake lightly. Gideon studied the other men in the room as Nikolai spoke, but the last sentence grabbed his attention. Gideon asked, "Someone procured me for you?" Nikolai twitched his nose with his thumb as he thought over his answer. Yes. You're now in Russia. You're not in the Empire anymore, Professor. Nikolai's strong Roshian accent made it difficult to understand all his words, but Gideon got the gist of it. Rosha stood over a day's train ride to the east from his hometown. Concern fluttered through Gideon before he clicked his tongue in the classic c'est la vie gesture. Excellent. I needed a holiday anyway. Does anyone have a drink? Preferably one with one of those pink umbrellas. No. When they didn't answer him, he demonstrated what he meant with a few gestures, but the men continued to stare at him, so he shrugged his shoulders in disappointed defeat. Something was off and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. It was the mathematician comment. The reason people never just called him a mathematician was because they could never get over what else he was. Gideon raised an eyebrow as he realized Nikolai might not know he was a dragon. Hara slapped a coin on the tavern counter. I'd like a name of an airship which will hire a woman. Hara decided the previous night as she walked the last mile to the town when she finally came to an epiphany. Her boy disguise only hid her fear of own identity and not her gender. Her father used to dress her as a boy to facilitate his cons. It wasn't like she enjoyed dressing as a boy. It wasn't who she was. Unfortunately, that meant she didn't know herself very well. Hara's attention returned to the present when the tavern owner put his hand over the coin. She slapped her hand over his so he couldn't retreat with the coin underneath until he told her what she wanted to know. He sniffed. There are some captains out back who will take on some women. She flashed the guy a grin and let him take the coin. At the back of the tavern, several men sat around playing a game of cards. Hara stepped up to the table and waited for them to acknowledge her. Eventually, one man glanced towards her. His gaze stripped her bare as he licked his lips. How can we help you, sweetheart? She wasn't perturbed by his tone. I'm an engineer. I'm looking for a berth. One of the other men chuckled. You can berth with me, honey. He patted his knee, suggesting she wouldn't be working as an engineer at all. She sighed. It didn't look like she would find a berth anytime soon. She flashed her teeth as she went for one of her gadgets.